On June 4, 1942, the Battle of Midway Island took place. The command of the Japanese Navy, which had a more powerful aircraft carrier force than the US. Navy, emboldened by the victory after the attack on the Hawaiian Islands, did not suspect that the secret data of our operational plan leaked to the enemy. Thus, we fell into a trap set by the enemy, who had already been alerted to the movement of our forces. As a result, the Japanese forces suffered a heavy defeat. Battle of Midway Island was a decisive battle that changed the entire course of the war in the Pacific. June 6th, our flying boat found 150 miles northeast of Midway Island. Midway American aircraft carrier Yorktown. The submarine I-168, which was in this area, having received an urgent radiogram with the order to sink the aircraft carrier, at a speed of 21 knots followed to the location of the target. At approximately 1 hour. 00 min. June 6th, the silhouette of a warship in the east. It was dawn. It was undoubtedly an aircraft carrier guarded by 5 to 6 destroyer squadrons. The boat approached, seeking a convenient position to attack. Having submerged and safely passed the ring of destroyer escorts, she surfaced at periscope depth. Observation through the periscope showed that the aircraft carrier had a slight trim aft. After another closer inspection, it was discovered that the aircraft carrier was being towed. Finally, the boat was able to get into position for a salvo. At 10 HRS, 00 minutes, 9 hours later. After first sighting the ship, 4 torpedoes were fired at it. A deafening explosion followed, eliciting cheers of exultation from the boat's crew. The destroyers guarding the Yorktown rushed to attack the boat. In a few minutes, 3 of them began depth bombing. Bomb explosions could be heard in the boat, the closest one throwing her up nearly a foot. The lights in the boat went out. Part of the battery was damaged, causing poisonous chlorine gas to begin to be emitted. Just when everyone thought the attack was over, 3 more explosions occurred, so close that the hull of the boat was shaken violently. Disfigured, almost unable to move, the boat was difficult to keep in an underwater position at a given depth. Work immediately began on fixing the electrical lighting and insulating the damaged batteries. Since it was impossible to power the pumps, the boat, which had a 20-deg stern trim, was like climbing a steep mountain. Still, there was hope for salvation. With such a large differential, the electricians who were busy working had to be supported so that they did not fall. Attempts to get the boat on an even keel by moving personnel and provisions to the bow were fruitless. Although there was no damage that threatened the boat's demise, damage to the batteries caused alarm as the electrical power supply was cut off, causing the boat to lose propulsion. The main challenge was to isolate the damaged batteries and attach serviceable ones. Although the crew had practiced extensively in isolating damaged batteries, the training drills had not prepared the personnel to deal with such severe damage. It seemed impossible to do such work in the dim light of emergency lights, in conditions when chlorine gas was poisoning the air, but finally the damaged batteries were isolated and the lighting circuit was energized. A check of the power circuit by a senior electrician gave satisfactory results. Turned on the switch, the engines started, the hope of salvation rose. The enemy destroyers were still above the boat, so air compressors could not be used, because they created a lot of noise during operation. There were no reserves of compressed air, with which to remove the water coming in through the aft torpedo tubes. Further stay of the boat in an underwater position became very dangerous. There was nothing left to do but to surface and engage the enemy. When the boat surfaced, 3 destroyers were at a distance of about 5 miles from her. In the meantime, it was discovered that electrolyte was leaking from the damaged batteries and that more battery cells needed to be replaced. Having detected the submarine, the destroyers went out to attack it and, as soon as the distance was somewhat reduced, opened artillery fire. The boat needed compressed air, at least in a small amount, but the enemy shells lay very close and the commander decided to dive again, expecting in the coming half an hour of darkness to break away from the enemy. Searching for the boat, destroyer squadrons passed exactly over it, but dropping a few more, apparently the last, depth bombs withdrew. The noise of their propellers became fainter and finally quieted down. The work in the boat was finished, and in it again appeared electric light. At 8 p.m. 00 minutes, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the boat surfaced safely and headed west into metropolitan waters at 16 knots, rounding the area where the bursts of flares were visible. What were the other submarines doing at the crucial moment of the battle off Midway Island? One of them was supposed to be at anchorage near the French frigate reefs and engaged in refueling the flying boats that were making a secondary reconnaissance of Pearl Harbor. However, when submarines I-21 and I-23 arrived with fuel supplies at French frigate reef in the second half of May, they found that there were American air transports and guard ships. The submarines I-171, I-174, and I-175 were used as intermediate radio communication vessels on the flight route of the flying boats and to provide overflight for the aircraft, but they had little success. On May 25th, a report was received from them. Due to enemy reconnaissance activity, our capabilities are very limited. Submarines were in position until May 31st, but the situation has not changed. The actions of reconnaissance Pearl Harbor was cancelled. No data on the situation in this naval base was not received. This time the Americans preempted us by sending to the area of their guarding forces. Submarines I-171, I-174, and I-175 were used as intermediate radio communication vessels on the flight route of flying boats and to ensure the flight of aircraft, but they could not do much. On May 25th, a report was received from them. Due to enemy reconnaissance activity, our capabilities are very limited. Submarines were in position until May 31st, but the situation has not changed. The actions of reconnaissance Pearl Harbor was cancelled. No data on the situation in this naval base was not received. This time the Americans preempted us by sending to the area of their guard forces. Other plans also failed. May 25th, 11 submarines I-156, I-157, I-158, I-162, I-165, I-166, I-168, I-169, I-171, I-174 and I-175 left Kwajalein and by June 6th, Midway with the task of preventing the approach of American reinforcements. However, the enemy became aware of our plan in advance, and so the forces of his operational connection passed by the island of Midway earlier than planned. Midway Island earlier than planned. Thus we only had to pursue him, being at such a great distance that none of the ships were not detected by submarines. We did not have an accurate idea of the location of the ships of the enemy's operational connection, as a result of which we could not use in the operation off Midway Island our submarines, except for one, that is, I-168. In 1942, the Japanese Fourth Fleet under the command of Vice Admiral Inouye carried out a bombardment of the port of Moresby with the aim of taking full possession of New Guinea. The fleet included the aircraft carriers Shokaki, Zuikaku, the light aircraft carrier Shoho, cruisers, destroyers, and transports. In addition, this fleet included the 21st Submarine Squadron, consisting of the boats Row 33. And Row 34, the 11th Squadron of the 8th Submarine Squadron, consisting of the boats I-29, and I-28, the 3rd Submarine Squadron, consisting of the boats I-22 and I-24. In late April, submarines Row ZZZ and Row 34 made a reconnaissance of Russell Island. Russell Island, anchorages at Duboyne, Jomar Passage and routes of approach from the east to the port of Moresby in order to identify enemy ships and transports at anchorages and nodes of maritime communications. On May 5th, submarines I-22, I-24, I-28 and I-29 reached their positions, but just like the boats Row ZZZ and Row 34, they failed to detect the enemy. Thus, in the battle in the Coral Sea, the submarines did not achieve any positive results, although they had no losses. On August 7, 1942, the first phase of a major American counteroffensive on Guadalcanal Island began. In the first naval battle off the Solomon Islands, the commander of the 8th Japanese Fleet, Admiral Mikawa, personally led cruiser forces into battle and achieved great success, but when he went into battle for the second time, he could not prevent the course of the landing of the enemy, nor sink his transports. The enemy not only held the airfield, but gradually strengthened the defences, and between August 1942 and February 1943, when the Japanese forces retreated from the island, there was fierce fighting on land, sea and air. Meanwhile, our submarines were engaged in bringing in supplies, destroying enemy transports, interfering with enemy resupply, refueling their aircraft or searching for enemy ships. In this way, they each contributed to the common cause. Unfortunately, there were no detailed good maps of the area, which created difficulties. It happened that the boats landed on shoals that were not mapped, so the action in this area was carried out in very difficult conditions. Moreover, incessant attacks by enemy aircraft and surface ships doubled our losses. From about September 1942, the effectiveness of the enemy radar stations increased, and our former advantage, explained by the superiority of our binoculars, soon disappeared when we had to face enemy aircraft in poor visibility conditions. Night fighting became difficult for us, and this was also a significant reason for the increase in our losses. On August 7th, after receiving word of the enemy landing on Guadalcanal Island, Admiral Mikawa immediately ordered all submarines under his command to concentrate in Indispensable Strait. Submarines Row 33, Row 34, I-121, I-122 and I-123 from the 7th Submarine Squadron went out to search for the enemy in the area of Lungi and Tulagi anchorages. The boat Row 33, after making contact with the surviving remnants of the garrison on Guadalcanal Island and giving them medical supplies, sank an enemy transport at the Lunga anchorage. This boat was then subjected to the continuous action of depth bombs for 18 miles of its journey, but only its periscope was damaged. Submarines I-121 and I-123 were ordered to bombard enemy landings, and submarine I-122 to search for the enemy in the area of the Santa Cruz Islands. In the attack against the enemy landing took part all available forces of the 8th Fleet, surface ships and all air units. Submarines were deployed in positions from IS. Guadalcanal along the southeastern Solomon Islands. On August 24th, submarines I-9, I-17, I-19, I-26, I-31, and I-33, urgently dispatched from Truk, arrived in the area of enemy lines of communication between San Cristobal and Endine Islands. Submarine I-26 northeast of the Solomon Islands detected an enemy task force consisting of an aircraft carrier, one line ship, a cruiser, and about 10 destroyers. The attack was difficult, but by firing a torpedo salvo, the boat struck the aircraft carrier, one torpedo hitting the target. After I-26 fired torpedoes, she was at a very close distance from the destroyers, so urgently dived to a depth of 90 meters. 4 depth bombs were dropped on the boat, the explosions of which caused no damage. Since the end of December 1942, submarines K-100, Row 101, Row 102 and Row 103 gradually became part of the newly created 7th Submarine Squadron. They were engaged in combat operations in the Rabaul area. These small displacement boats, intended for coastal protection, operated mainly on the approaches to the port of Moresby, in the area southeast of Milne Bay, east of the central Solomon Islands, in the passage of Jamari, sometimes used as vehicles. By mid-August 1943, the 7th Squadron had lost Row 34, Row 102, Row 103, and Row 107 in action, with only the transport Row 106 sunk in July. April 1, 1943 began a major offensive by the combined forces of the Navy and aviation. Personal leadership of the operation was carried out by the commander of the United Fleet, Admiral Yamamoto. As a result of quickly followed one after another attacks on April 7th, some success was achieved, but due to the overwhelming superiority of enemy aircraft, this success could not play a significant role in the operation. In early May, the Allied armies landed on the island of Rendova and began the offensive in a westerly direction to New Guinea. The landing of enemy landings on Rendova Island, the Japanese army resisted stubbornly, using the available forces on the ground and reinforcements hastily delivered from Rabaul. The actions of ground forces were supported from the sea attacks of destroyers and cruisers, which was the flagship of the squadron, but as a result of active actions of naval and air forces of the enemy Japanese ships. In fact, our forces were defeated. Submarines of the type Row 100 hurried to the area of military operations. Boat Row 101, which followed ahead of the others, was tasked to go to the west coast of the island, Guadalcanal, in order to prevent the landing of the enemy. Beginning in mid-August 1943, the submarine detachment consisting of Row 104, Row 105, Row 108 and Row 109, reinforced by other boats, continued to perform the same tasks as before. However, the boats could not prevent the landing of enemy paratroopers at any point where they wished. During September, submarines Row 101, Row 105, Row 106, and Row 109 concentrated their efforts in the area south and southeast of the Solomon Islands group. The boats Row 100, Row 104 and Row 108 were to attack the enemy off eastern New Guinea vicinity of Yuan Bay. But these activities did not produce direct results. However, submarine Row 105 rescued the crew from an airplane that made an emergency landing. The submarine Row 101 was missing in action. Thus, Row submarines performed various kinds of tasks and did not have time and opportunity to repair mechanisms and rest of personnel. The submarine Row 108, which had been operating since late September in the Yuan Bay area, detected 3 enemy destroyers 50 miles north of Cape Ward Hunt on October 3 and attacked them. Although the boat itself was heavily attacked by depth bombs, 2 destroyers were sunk by her. Submarines Row 106 and Row 109 operating in January in the area of Yuan Bay detected several enemy transports and guard ships, but were unable to attack them. Submarine Row 105, operating in the area of Salamaua Point, also did not have the opportunity to attack the enemy. Due to the critical situation on Bougainville Island in late October, the submarine Row 100 went to Buin with a cargo of submarines. On November 25, this boat, before reaching Buin, was torpedoed and sunk 30 miles west of Oima Island. Submarines Row 104 and Row 105, which had left in late October and early November with cargo to Salamaua, were ordered to assist their forces in the vicinity of Is. However, no positive results were achieved, although the boats did succeed in rescuing the crew of the light cruiser Sendai on November 2 and the crews of several aircraft that had crashed on November 6. In early November, our cruiser was attacked by enemy aircraft after the ship had entered the port of Rabaul. Since other surface ships were also subjected to constant air attacks during which they were damaged, it was decided to recall the flagship of the 7th Submarine Squadron, Tagay, from Rabaul to metropolitan waters. The squadron headquarters went ashore from the ship and was stationed at the submarine base. By the end of November, the 7th Squadron was composed of the boats Row 100, Row 104, Row 105 and Row 109. In addition to them, the submarines I-6, I-16, I-38, and I-117 carried out cargo transportation tasks. Due to heavy enemy air raids, Rabaul in general could not be used as a submarine base in the future, and in March 1944, the headquarters of the 7th Squadron and the remaining submarines Row 104, Row 105, Row 105, Row 108 and Row 109 redeployed to Truk. By this time the submarines Row 34, Row 100, Row 102, Row 103 and Row 107 had been lost, and our total submarine losses in the Solomon Islands, New Guinea and Coral Sea area were estimated at 25. Enemy losses from the actions of our submarines included the aircraft carrier Wasp and 14 other ships. In addition, 3 ships were severely damaged. It should be remembered that the main efforts of our submarines were concentrated on depriving the enemy of the ability to bring food, although these efforts did not increase his losses. In July 1942, after completing an advanced course at the submarine school, I was assigned to command the submarine Row 31 as part of the Yokosuka Naval Base Force. We were too busy with continuous training, much-needed testing and research. One day a truck loaded with sacks of rice suddenly appeared on the wharf near the military port. The arriving representatives of the command offered us to conduct an unusual test, i.e., to fire the boat's torpedo tubes with sacks of rice. By this time, the situation on Guadalcanal Island had become so complicated that it was dangerous for our submarines to unload and transfer food to the island's garrison while in a surface position, so we came up with the idea of throwing sacks of food through torpedo tubes. For 3 days we tried all sorts of variations. We shot out rice in cookie boxes, but 1/3 of them were broken by protrusions inside the torpedo tubes, and the rice they contained was scattered all over Tokyo Bay. We then came up with the idea of pouring the rice into rubber containers which were placed on deck and fastened with special fixtures. The fasteners of these containers were given from inside the boat, which was in an underwater position. Finally, we tried firing rice in torpedo-shaped wooden pencil cases, but the pencil cases broke apart just as the bags of rice broke apart. Even before these tests, we should have had in mind that the use of such plywood torpedoes would prove futile, as the shot required high pressure to overcome the pressure of the overboard water, and the reduced pressure would be insufficient to produce a normal shot. At the end of the trials, the commander of Yokosuka Naval Base, obviously very upset, told us of the extremely difficult situation of the garrison on Guadalcanal Island and the need for further activities similar to the above trials. As a consequence of the fact that we continued to suffer heavy losses in surface craft, which was due to the superiority of the enemy in the air, as well as our lack of airfields, the only means of delivering food to the garrison of Guadalcanal Island remained the squadrons. Guadalcanal remained destroyers and submarines. In fact, after the defeat of our troops during the Third General Offensive of the enemy, there was no hope of restoring the airfield, and the fate of the garrison of the island depended entirely on the delivery of food by submarines. In Truk, on board the flagship of the submarine fleet, held a meeting to discuss the situation. Senior officers of all formations and submarine commanders protested against sending boats to certain death simply for the sake of food delivery, that is, to solve a task that is not peculiar to submarines. However, the admiral in command of the submarine fleet announced that it was an imperial command to provide food for the troops on Guadalcanal at any cost. The voices of protest were silenced. Thus the submarines became transports. Most of the boats were at that time on reconnaissance in the Pacific and Indian Oceans and in Australian waters, searching for enemy warships and merchant ships. After the above decision, they were recalled to the area of Guadalcanal Island. Guadalcanal Island. One gun was removed from each boat, and only 2 torpedo tubes were left. This disarmament, while providing more space for loading food, greatly reduced the boat's combat capability. On November 16, 1942, the commander of the United Fleet issued an order establishing the following order of operations. Food was to be loaded at the port of Buin on Bougainville Island and delivered to Caminpo on Guadal Island. 1 submarine was dispatched daily, following a route southwest of the New Georgia group of islands. When at the same time with the boats were used as a means of transportation destroyers, they were scheduled for separate routes and areas of operation to avoid meeting with the boats. In the case of large crowds of ships, the transportation of cargo by submarines was cancelled. In order to avoid encounters with super-small boats, all routes were to be south of Savo Island. Food was to be unloaded mainly after sunset at nightfall. Despite heavy losses, the supply of food to the garrison on Guadalcanal Island was carried out for 3 months, from November 1942 to the beginning of February 1943, when Guadalcanal was completely abandoned by us. In early December 1942, 11 submarines were used to deliver food under the same scheme on New Guinea Island to Buna Point. By January 1943, about 20 submarines, including the newest, were being used for supply purposes. On February 7th, the evacuation from Guadalcanal Island was completed, by which time only 2 boats were still engaged in food delivery to New Guinea. Gradually, the method of transportation of supplies improved. At first, bags of rice were transferred from inside the boat and carried to the boats by hand. The rice was then packed in rubber bags on the upper deck, but these got wet, so from January the rubber bags were replaced by barrels. If it was dangerous for the boat itself to surface at the designated unloading point, the boat's crew could give the barrels anchorages, which floated to the surface. In the second half of January, cargo tubes were used off Guadalcanal Island, with the area off Cape Esperance being the intended landing site. Cargo tubes resembled motorized boarding vehicles with a deck. They could hold up to 2 tons of cargo. They were propelled by 2 torpedoes, providing a speed of up to 3 knots. The radius of action of such tubes reached 3,650 meters. Such a floating vehicle was operated by one person who boarded it from a submarine in the underwater position. There was another method of supplying the garrison on Guadalcanal Island. Food was loaded into a special tank that was towed by a submarine and could dive to depth following the submarine towing it. Such tanks could hold up to 50 tons of cargo, but they were not widely used. At the beginning of 1943, the garrison was still being supplied by 1 submarine a day, even though as the enemy's forces accumulated in the area, our successes were correspondingly diminishing. But there was no other option, and this method of supplying the garrison on Guadalcanal Island continued until the end of the campaign. January 26th, submarine I-1 under the command of the new commander, Lieutenant Commander Sakamoto, left Rabaul with the expectation that in 3 days to arrive at Guadalcanal Island and to unload food there at night. During this period, supplies were delivered to the island every other day. One boat could supply a garrison of 30,000 men with 2 days' supply of food. The voyage from the base to the island and back took 4 days. From the island. Bougainville, the passage was made in an underwater position day and night. The boat surfaced only for 4 hours to charge batteries. The place of unloading was the point of Cominpo. Usually the boat approached the anchorage at dusk in a positional position and passed behind the reefs only after careful additional reconnaissance. This time the submarine I-1 followed the usual route. At the passage through the reefs, as soon as the boat raised the periscope, she was attacked from the stern by an American torpedo boat, which opened fire with machine guns and fired torpedoes at the boat from a distance of about 1,800 meters. Sakamoto immediately abandoned the idea of going behind the reef. Without waiting for the periscope to be retracted, he changed course, and in a desperate attempt to evade the attack ordered the boat to dive to a depth of 27 meters. Almost immediately depth bombs began to burst over the boat, causing its hull to shake violently. The lights in the boat suddenly went out, the main switch on the distribution board was blown out of place, all the motors stopped, the steering control failed, and the pumps stopped working. The high-pressure air line was damaged, the batteries were knocked out, and confusion set in at the central station. The boat began to dive uncontrollably with a bow trim of 45 deg, so naturally all loose cargo and objects began to move to the bow. Sakamoto gave the order, blow out the main ballast tanks and give full throttle back. The working diving depth for the boat I-1 was considered to be 58 meters. The depth gauge showed 137 meters, although its readings after the bombing became extremely inaccurate. The sailor, who stood at the control of the aft horizontal rudders and experienced a serious fright during the failure of the submarine at depth, reported that the arrow of the depth gauge stopped. Then the boat began to surface, but at that time the commander reported, "Water is entering the torpedo room." The bow differential increased, causing the entire food load to shift to the bow of the boat. Suddenly the boat jumped to the surface and submerged again. However, due to the strong trim on the bow, it was almost impossible to go in the underwater position. Then the boat touched the ground. It was time to take decisive measures. With great difficulty, the boat managed to surface. Having opened fire on destroyers and torpedo boats, the boat was barely able to make 4 or 5 volleys. As machine gun fire of the enemy, she had destroyed the bridge and killed all the personnel on it, except the navigator, who promptly went down the gangway to the central post with the cry, "To the sabres." To the sabres, to those inside the boat, this was the first news of what was happening on the upper deck. The senior assistant to the boat commander with sabre in hand jumped out on the bridge and found that all the servants at the gun had been killed. The boat commander was not present. He immediately gathered the spare gun crew and, looking around in the advancing dusk, found an enemy torpedo boat behind the stern on the port side, for some reason not firing. The submarine left Rabaul with a damaged port-side diesel engine and, going under one diesel engine, could reach a speed of no more than 12 knots. The boat was difficult to steer, but the XO turned to the left, approaching the enemy boat. The navigator, who was famous for his fencing skills, tried to jump on board of the enemy boat with a sabre in his hands, but the laths of the boat were too high, and clinging to them with one hand, he hung in the air, being unable to get on board. At this moment the vessels separated. The enemy again opened fire. There were, I think, 3 or 4 enemy ships around the boat. Soon the gasoline in the motorized transfer vehicle, which was at the stern of the submarine, caught fire. A bright flash, like a giant torch, illuminated the boat, allowing the enemy ships to see it clearly, while they themselves were not visible from the boat. In addition, the enemy turned on his searchlights. 2 of his submarine hunting boats opened fire with 50 mm guns and 20 mm machine guns. It was difficult to determine exactly, but in addition to the hunter boats, the enemy apparently had 2 torpedo boats. The boat continued to fire the guns, but the enemy gunboats came in from the stern, giving them an advantage. When the boat was refitted, the stern gun had to be removed in order to accommodate the motorized crossing vehicle at the stern, so it was at such a disadvantage. The torpedo boat, attacking from the stern, was fired tracer bullets from machine gun and rifles, but it was not effective. On the other hand, the enemy, firing at the well-lit boat, often covered the target. His shells literally riddled the fighting deckhouse. The rudder control mechanisms were knocked out of order. We had to switch to manual control. torpedo boats fired 3 torpedoes at the boat. Fortunately, none of them hit the target. While absorbed in the battle, the boat's senior assistant commander shouted orders. A shell from the 140 mm gun hit an enemy boat, which sank to the enthusiastic shouts of the boat's personnel. One of the enemy's torpedo boats, which was on the starboard side, suddenly came out to attack, which was reflected by rifle fire on it. The fire from the boat subsided, possibly running out of ammunition, but it continued forward, rammed the boat and moved away from it. Having fought hard for 1 hour and 30 minutes, the I-1 boat was on the brink of destruction. The tanks had received many breaches. The senior assistant commander decided to ground the boat and accordingly turned her toward the shore. At the same moment she touched the ground, her stern sank and her bow protruded above the water, with the boat tilted heavily to port. The crew members on the upper deck immediately left the boat and went ashore, while those inside the boat were unable to escape as the water suddenly broke through, killing more than 30 people. The 50 survivors gathered on the shore with 2 sabres and 3 rifles. It was remarkable that despite the numerous breaches, the boat remained afloat for such a long time. This was due to the continuous operation of the low-pressure casting pump, which under normal conditions could only run continuously for a quarter of an hour, as it quickly overheated. When the boat's demise became apparent, secret documents were prepared for destruction, but only some of them were destroyed. In order not to attract the attention of enemy aircraft, they were not burned but torn and buried in the sand. However, there was a danger that some of the secret documents remaining in the boat would fall into enemy hands, so orders were given to securely destroy these documents as well. 3 sailors under the command of an officer reached the boat under cover of darkness and blew it up so that it finally sank. The surviving part of the boat's crew was subsequently taken ashore by a squadron destroyer. In order to surely prevent the possibility of the enemy seizing secret documents, one of our submarines was ordered to completely destroy the submarine I-1 lying on the ground. The same order was given to our airplane, which, however, could not find the remains of the sunken boat. September 4, 1943, submarine I-177 under the command of Lieutenant Commander D. Orita, coming with food in Leh, surfaced at the appointed time. The situation in Leh was critical. It looked as if the town would be abandoned by the Japanese garrison after the food was transferred from the boat. According to reports received by the boat even before arriving at Leh, part of the town was already occupied by the enemy and buildings were burning. There was every reason to believe that the garrison would not hold out long. The cargo from the boat was transferred to 2 lighters that came up. The boat received 18 men seriously wounded. During these actions, the boat was fired upon from the shore. Having quickly finished receiving the wounded, she headed for the return trip, but not 5 min. Had passed when the observer reported torpedo boats on the starboard side. The boat quickly submerged to avoid meeting them. 5 min. When she surfaced again, 2 torpedo boats were still visible off the starboard side. The boat submerged again. The sounders indicated the presence of 5 more destroyer squadrons. In fact, she was surrounded. It was out of the question to engage, jeopardizing the wounded, so the boat noiselessly walked away from the pursuing ships. The next point to which supplies were to be delivered was Finschhafen, but because of heavy activity in the area by American aircraft, the submarine I-177 was unable to transfer the cargo. In the third and subsequent attempts unloaded not in Leh, but in Siao, which had to be kept strictly secret. Supply boat operations during the full moon were prohibited. From 3 to 5 submarines were employed at a time. Each of them could hold 40 to 50 tons of cargo inside the strong hull and 20 to 30 tons on deck. Typically, the boat would leave Rabaul and sail along the north coast of New Britain in surface water on the first day. On the second day, it was necessary to go underwater during daylight hours because of the danger of enemy air attack. The boat could only surface at night or at dawn to recharge her batteries. On the third day, 3 hours before sunset, supplies were prepared for unloading. To the place of unloading, the boat had to approach before sunset and inform the troops on shore of its arrival by light signal through a raised periscope. A return signal was to be made from shore. Half an hour after sunset, the boat would surface and wait for the lighter to arrive to transfer cargo and men. The whole transfer usually took 20 minutes, after which the boat could load. A great danger for the boat would be the appearance of an enemy airplane or ship's watch during this time. All personnel of the boat were involved in unloading. in order to prevent the sudden appearance of the enemy organized increased surveillance. After the unloading work was completed, the boat left the area at full speed in the surface position, then went first in the underwater position, and then in the surface position as during the transition to the place of unloading, returning to Rabaul on the 7th day after leaving it. However, such actions did not last long. Since October 20, 1943, the daytime raids of the American aviation on Rabaul intensified. They were made by the enemy regularly at 10 o'clock in the morning. By this hour, our naval aviation fighters were taking to the air to meet the enemy planes. Submarines were preparing to dive, cruisers and destroyers raised anchors and brought in readiness to repel the air raid. When formations of B-17, B-25 and P-38 aircraft appeared over Rabaul, the submarines would hastily dive directly into the anchorage areas. 36 meters of water a good natural defense. But even under these conditions, bombs dropped nearby would cause discomfort and shake the boat. Eventually, the submarines began to leave Rabaul for Sioyo before the afternoon raid, and return to the harbour in the afternoon. It was very unpleasant to listen to the broadcasts of the main headquarters about the results of daily raids on Rabaul. The number of fighters capable of countering enemy air raids and ships in the harbour every day decreased. In late November, American troops occupied part of the island of Bougainville and Rabaul. Although the final victory was still preached to our soldiers, the fact of defeat in the forward positions was not hidden from them. On November 25th, while resting at Rabaul after returning from a hike to Sio, we were put on alert and called to headquarters. That night, 3 destroyers with troops evacuating from Bougainville Island to Rabaul were surrounded by the enemy and sunk 90 miles west of Cape St. George. We were ordered to go to this area to rescue the men. The boat proceeded at full speed to the scene, taking precautions not to be detected by the enemy's planes and reconnaissance ships. Arriving at the site, we found a large number of people swimming. In fact, the boat surfaced in the thick of them. Having organized a careful observation of the air, we proceeded to rescue the victims. Lifebuoys were thrown on the water. The crew helped the wounded to climb aboard the boat. A total of 227 people had been picked up, so practically the people in the boat had a hard time moving. When we headed back to Rabaul, 2 bombs were dropped by enemy planes. We urgently loaded ourselves. The pressure inside the boat was terrible. The doctor and orderlies did not have time to serve the wounded. Because of the terrible heat and the smell of oil, the conditions in the boat were unbearable. There was not enough fresh air, so after 2 hours we surfaced and took a course to Rabaul, arriving there the next day, that is November 26th, at 8 o'clock in the morning. Having disembarked the rescued men, we put to sea again for the purpose of rescuing perhaps the survivors still alive. By December, the Allied troops had landed in the western part of New Britain, and the way to Sio was cut off for us. The enemy's fast torpedo boats were very active. Our torpedoes posed no danger to the enemy, and his depth bombs were deadly to us. On January 1, 1944, while we were conducting a service in honor of the Emperor, Rabaul was subjected to a heavy raid by enemy aircraft. As usual, we loaded up and lay on the ground. In the port of Rabaul were now usually 1 or more submarines, and so when these few boats during the raids were submerged, no ships were visible in the port. On January 2nd, we were informed that the headquarters of the 18th Army and the headquarters of the forces of the 18th Naval Base had become encircled. A plan of action was being developed to free them. Exit from the encirclement in Madang overland route through the jungle would take 2 months. This way was rejected, and the command decided to evacuate by sea on submarines, which were to go to the rescue as soon as possible. On the evening of January 3rd, encouraged by wishes of success, we set out for Sio. As usual, it was intended to arrive at the appointed point half an hour after sunset, but suddenly we encountered a very strong oncoming current. At the appointed hour, we were still 5 miles from Sio, but, going at the maximum speed of surface running, we were only 20 minutes late. 2 motorboats with staff officers on board were just approaching the boat when the lookout reported, "I see 2 enemy torpedo boats." After hastily putting everything in order on the upper deck and warning the staff officers that we would come again tomorrow, we loaded up and headed out to sea. Torpedo boats circled over the boat, and after 30 min, we heard the sounds of 2 depth bombs bursting, which the boats dropped as a farewell. During the night, the submarine had gotten 30 miles away from Sio. Next morning we again came to the rendezvous point and received a signal from shore, but again a torpedo boat appeared, and the rendezvous was postponed for another day. This time the boat stayed overnight in the area, intending to surface as soon as the torpedo boat left. The enemy, however, spotted the boat's dive site and dropped 4 depth bombs. Fortunately, the boat was not damaged, as it was at great depth. On January 8th, it was decided to carry out the intended plan of action, even if it required engaging a torpedo boat. We again arrived at the designated rendezvous point and signaled, "We are all right. Prepare to load." Well, the boat surfaced, and soon the gunboat came aboard her. The staff officers went down inside the boat, and just as we began to load equipment aboard, an observer reported torpedo boats. They were on the horizon, so we should expect an attack from their side in 2 to 3 men. The boat began to sink rapidly. At that moment we heard the sounds of bursts hitting the target and frequent firing. The boat sank to a depth of 55 meters and took a course for Madang. The enemy did not pursue us. The alert was over, and after lights out the personnel was transferred to the usual 3-shift watch. There was an opportunity to rest and greet the army and naval officers, who seemed more than grateful for our rescue. As darkness fell, the boat surfaced and went at full speed, sheltered by a thunderstorm. At dawn she submerged again and reached the entrance to Madang Harbour by sunset in the midst of a raid on the harbour by R-38 aircraft. After the raid we surfaced and disembarked our passengers. The mission was accomplished successfully. It had been about a year since the submarine I-177 left the waters of the metropolis. She was badly in need of repairs. In addition, Rabaul was no longer a safe anchorage. Based at Rabaul, many Japanese submarines went out on combat tours, and at least 8 of them did not return. On January 10, 1944, the boat I-177 left this memorable place for Truk. At the beginning of the war, Lt. Araki served as navigator with me on the submarine I-24. He later became a minesweeper on I-176, which delivered supplies to the Leh area. The following are his notes on the combat activities of this boat. On March 19, 1943, the submarine I-176, performing the task of delivering ammunition and food to the Leh area, surfaced under cover of night about 400 meters west of the designated unloading point. The boat was commanded by Captain 3rd Rank Tanabe, an officer known throughout the fleet for sinking the American aircraft carrier Yorktown during the Battle off Midway Island. The crew was specially selected after the boat was refitted in May 1942. I-176 was the first boat to successfully deliver cargo to Guadalcanal Island on October 20, 1942. She sank the American battleship Texas in the same area. The boat further distinguished itself in the actions to supply the garrison of Guadalcanal Island. From the very beginning of actions to deliver supplies to Guadalcanal Island, most of the submarines in the area ceased to perform their combat missions and were fully occupied with the tasks of transporting personnel, ammunition and food. The submarine crews were also fully aware of the serious situation in which we were to operate. Before informing our subordinates of the undesirable tasks we were ordered to perform, we had some doubts as to whether they would be able to react properly to what they heard. However, the submarine crews appeared to fully understand the military situation and overcame their natural feelings, fully committed to the new tasks, despite the fact that we often had to hear bad news about the fate of the submarines. From the personnel of the submarine I-176 could never hear the words, "We cannot." The command of the coastal base in Leh, eagerly awaiting the submarine, sent landing boats even before receiving the conditional signal. The boats were approaching. The submarine crew was at battle stations waiting for the order to begin unloading. Finally, the landing boats were moored at the side of the boat, and by order of the commander began unloading the cargo. The crew was specially scheduled for this task, and the work proceeded in an organized manner. For the people on shore, the sacks of rice delivered by the boat I-176 were a means of livelihood, and these people looked at us as saviors. It was getting dark. Only half of the cargo had been unloaded, when several rockets flew up from the shore signal post, followed by continuous machine gun fire. The commander gave the order to dive, and I hurried down. But we could not escape the attack of 3 medium bombers. As soon as my feet touched the deck of the central post, there were sounds of machine gun bursts and bomb explosions. One of the explosions threw the boat upward and it began to lurch to port. I grasped the bulkhead of the center station compartment to keep myself upright, and for a moment my breath caught. The next thing I heard was the order, blow out the port side main ballast tank. The boat shuddered and then slowly began to straighten up. Deafened by the explosions of falling bombs, under machine gun fire, the crew hurriedly descended into the boat. The depth gauge arrow moved very slowly. Machine gun bullets showered the deckhouse as if in pursuit of the fleeing crew. One bullet hit the back of the head of the helmsman standing on the helm. He died without saying a word. I tried to speak to them, and saw that they were dying. Someone shouted there's water coming into the boat. Examination showed that water was coming through the top of the deckhouse on the left side. This was followed by a report that water was getting into the radio room as well. The order was given: close the watertight bulkheads. The water was coming in through the holes in the submarine all the way to the center station. When I looked around for the commander, I saw him sitting behind the anti-aircraft periscope, whispering something in a weak voice. He seemed to be having trouble breathing. At last, the petty officer of the signalman pulled the hatch cover shut. The boat was sinking, having opened the ventilation valves of the main tanks. Meanwhile, the crews of the landing boats, which had scattered in all directions, watched the splashes of water and flashes caused by bomb explosions and enemy machine gun fire, which for a moment enveloped the whole boat, especially when a bomb exploded and hit her stern. Then the boat seemed to begin to lurch more and more to port, sinking all the time, and those watching from the gunboats thought she had sunk. Later, a signal was intercepted from the destroyer squadron that the boat had been sunk. The enemy probably thought he had accomplished his task. It was a great fortune for us that he did not repeat the attack, but the damage already done to us was already considerable. The signalman and petty officer helmsman were killed. The boat commander and another signalman were badly wounded, and there were breaches in the strong hull. The left side of the deckhouse and radio room had 5 cm diameter holes. The low-pressure airline pipes were broken in many places, the trim tanks were flooded. The main ballast and fuel tanks also had holes in many places. Gathering the personnel of the boat, we explained the dangerous position we were in. We were in danger of perishing. By means of continuous blowing of the main tank on the port side, we finally managed to eliminate the roll of the boat and stop its sinking. But for this we had to use up a large amount of high-pressure air, and it was possible that we would not have been able to continue blowing the tanks. The buoyancy of the boat decreased as the air from the main tanks and the airline rapidly disappeared, and the boat became heavier. Water was still coming in through the deckhouse. It was also entering the boat through the periscope glands. The emergency party desperately tried to patch up the breaches with rags and anything else they could get their hands on, while others prepared wooden plugs from the emergency struts. The radios were partially damaged, and repairs were delayed by the assembly of spare parts. Since the boat commander was badly wounded, command passed to me as senior officer. Thus the fate of the boat was in my hands. I had to decide whether the boat should remain underwater or whether it should be resurfaced. Taking into account the inflow of water into the boat, I realized that staying underwater any longer could ruin us. At the same time, it seemed to me that the lack of high-pressure air would make it impossible for the boat to float properly. Even if we could surface for a short time, we could be attacked again by the enemy, and that meant surrendering the boat to him with our own hands. I racked my brain for a solution, then almost intuitively said, "Commander, we'll go ashore and make the necessary repairs." The commander nodded his head in agreement. This was undoubtedly the most correct decision. If, when we went ashore, the boat was submerged, that is, had a considerable draught, we would be able to get off without much difficulty even at very high tide. Being on the ground, we could concentrate all forces and means on finding out the damages and repairing them, and do this work secretly from the enemy, being somewhat covered by the shade of tropical trees growing on the shore. If the draught was insufficient, the boat would be in full view at low tide. We would have to worry constantly about its stability, and moreover would be able to do only part of the work. It was necessary to take the risk, although the boat might have remained forever on the coast off Ley. From the moment of the enemy's attack, the actions of the crew had become automatic, instinctive. The men had not lost their composure, which is explained either by the invisible patronage of the gods, or by the manifestation of our inner strength and endurance in critical circumstances. Wading through the water, I reached the periscope to make an observation. Apart from dark patches that might have been reflections of the shore or sky, Nothing was visible. With some concentration, I managed to get a glimpse of the entrance to the mouth of some river. The seabed in the southern seas is dotted with coral reefs. You can't rely entirely on nautical charts. I had experienced this firsthand on a reconnaissance off Buna Point, when we became entangled in a maze of reefs and had great difficulty in getting out of them. If we were to go ashore, there was nothing left to do but to head for the mouth of the river. I gave the command, and the boat slowly, as if wandering, headed for the mouth of the river. The arrow of the depth gauge, faintly illuminated by a single light bulb in the dark central station, moved slowly from the 7.3 m mark to the 8.2 m mark. I realized that all eyes were fixed on it. Then the hand began to slowly move in the opposite direction the crisis passed as we approached the shoal. Water had stopped coming in through the breaches. The leaking has stopped. All is well, my voice shook with joy. As we approached, the shadow from the shore increased. The commands, small back, stop, full back, quickly alternated one after another. The boat touched the ground with a slight shake. She stopped with only a slight trim. Those in the central station breathed a sigh of relief. The words "both engines stopped" echoed throughout the boat, then subsided. The tension eased, and after a brief pause, we began to think about the danger we were currently in and the difficulties we had to overcome. The most important factor was time. At the moment when the boat landed on the ground, it was just low tide. We had to get on deck, make the necessary repairs so that when the tide came in we could get off the shoal in time to accomplish our main task. First of all, it was necessary to make sure that the running bridge was above water. For this purpose, we loosened the hatch flap a little. The water did not leak inside the boat. Having fully opened the hatch, I went out on the bridge and looked around with binoculars. There was nothing suspicious to be seen, and the surroundings were silent. Only the bow of the boat and the bridge protruded above the water. I posted observers on the bridge, took out and lit a cigarette with a trembling hand. It seemed strange, but my smoking gave confidence to the people around me. At least that's what they told me later. It was necessary to lift the boat a little more out of the water to begin the work of repair. I ordered the main ballast tanks to be blown out, and soon the upper deck and buoys were showing out of the water. I ordered the blowing to cease and closed the kingstones. The consumption of high-pressure air was very high, and we had already used most of it. The emergency party on standby in the central station went up to the upper deck, inspected the damage and began repairs. The high-pressure air compressor was turned on. Many holes were found in the hull of the boat. To make it more convenient to inspect the hull of the boat from the upper deck, it was necessary to remove some sheets of the superstructure. During this work, the chief mechanic came up to the bridge and said that with the damage found it would be difficult to return to Rabaul, and then asked if it would be better for us to go ashore. The large roll of the boat has a huge psychological effect, and I knew that the crew had already experienced it after the last bomber attack. I explained the situation to the chief mechanic and said the boat has sustained very serious damage, but that doesn't mean it's out of commission. I am confident that we will be able to return to Rabaul after we complete the necessary repairs. I am determined to see it through. Even if we are attacked by the enemy, the confidence with which I spoke these words to him further strengthened my resolve. Taking advantage of a free moment, I went below to visit the commander in his quarters. His face, owing to the great loss of blood, was deathly pale, and he was half unconscious. "If I am to die like this, it would be better for a bullet to finish me at once," he said. I informed him that I would try to get away from here before daybreak at high tide and after a trial dive, even if the repairs were not completed. To this he remarked that it would be better to spend the whole of the next day on the spot, and to be fully satisfied that the boat was really seaworthy. Although we all wished to return to base as soon as possible, taking the commander's advice into account, I concluded that it would be better to spend the day on the ground, make sure the boat was seaworthy, and give the personnel a chance to rest. Through the efforts of the crew, one hole after another was repaired. Only rags, wooden wedges and plugs were used in the repair. This was enough to allow the boat to sink after all the holes were fixed. But there were a lot of holes. Some were up to 26 cm in diameter and were fixed with patches. Most of them were about 5 cm in diameter, and it took a long time to make wooden plugs for them. Examination of the damage from the deck revealed a 10 cm diameter hole in the port side main tank. There was no other damage to the tanks. There was a pile of rice containers on the aft deck. It appeared that an enemy bomb had exploded just above them. The landing boat personnel were very surprised to see the boat beached, as they believed it had been sunk. The boat came aboard. We asked to receive the ammunition, medical supplies, and food still on the submarine, as well as 2 wounded men. I told the commander that we had no opportunity to organize proper medical care for him on the boat, and since the return passage to Rabaul would be dangerous, offered to carry him ashore, but he flatly refused. The bodies of the 2 men killed, the wounded and some ammunition were transferred to the landing boat, and it departed, escorted by the looks of the boat's crew. 4 more landing boats then arrived and took the rest of the load of arms, ammunition, and food from the boat. Our task was thus accomplished. The officer from the landing boat shook my hand and wished me a smooth voyage to Rabaul. At last the tide began to come in, and by midnight the boat, the bow of which was exposed so that the torpedo caps were visible, was up to the waterline in water. Air was blown into the boat from a low-pressure airline to ascertain whether there were any more unrepaired holes. The results of the emergency repairs, completed almost at high tide, were checked. The high-pressure air cylinders were filled, the batteries charged, and the boat was again in good order. It was now possible to try to get off the shoal. We turned the motors on full reverse, but the boat didn't move. It was probably buried pretty deep in the sand. Then I tried to rock the boat by making the crew run from one side to the other. The engines continued to run at full power, sending the jet from the propellers under the bottom of the boat. This measure gradually caused the hull of the boat to rock and free it from the ground. I ordered the diesels to start, gave full reverse, and the boat finally moved. The crew cheered, shouting their approval and running out onto the bridge to congratulate me. At dawn we loaded, but contrary to our assumptions, the voyage was not so smooth. We lay on the ground at a depth of 36 meters. The bottom was probably uneven, as there was a trim of 15 deg. There was no water seeping through the newly patched holes, but I placed observers in each compartment to watch for possible water ingress. The personnel, free from watch, got a well-deserved rest. Staggering with fatigue, I walked around the boat, inspecting each compartment, and found that the level in the water glass of one of the trim tanks was gradually rising. Undoubtedly a hole had been left somewhere unrepaired, the search for which had to be left until I returned to Rabaul, where the ship repairers at the base could make a detailed inspection of the boat. I was very tired, and having hardly reached my bunk, fell into a deep sleep, and when I awoke the watch showed the time of sunset. We spent the whole day at the pound without any trouble, but when we surfaced it seemed to me that the boat was unusually heavy. Perhaps there was a leak somewhere that we hadn't noticed while we slept. Observation through the periscope confirmed the onset of dusk. I ordered the personnel to take up their posts according to the dive schedule and headed out of the bay at 18 knots. The night of March 20th to 21st passed without incident. At dawn we dived again. If this period of being underwater had passed quietly, there was still one more night crossing left before the approaches to Rabaul. I was somewhat disturbed by the fact that the water in the damaged trim tank was gradually arriving, and the dewatering pump had to run continuously all the way. About noon we discovered that the tank we had been using as an equalizing tank was dry. What was to be done? If we surfaced, we would naturally be detected by an enemy patrol plane. We could pump fuel from the fuel tank into the main ballast tank, but it was feared that the fuel might leak out through the holes in the main ballast tank. We could also fire torpedoes or free ourselves from some other heavy load, but I could only do this as a last resort. As a temporary measure, we blew out the starboard side's middle main ballast tank and then equalized trim by taking water into the trim tank. The blowing of the tank was strictly controlled to prevent the possibility of air leaking to the surface of the water, which would give away our location. As a consequence of blowing the starboard ballast tank, the boat was given a 3-deg roll to port, which, however, caused no trouble. This procedure was repeated 2 or 3 times during the afternoon, and thus we were able to stay submerged until sunset and surfaced only in darkness. It was a clear, starry night and a calm sea. It was the kind of night we had been waiting for a long time. The diesels worked smoothly and, despite the high speed, did not smoke. Generally speaking, our mood was cheerful, although there was no hint of letting our guard down. The boat went along the coast of New Britain. The personnel stood at battle stations, conducted a careful observation. When suddenly heard a shout enemy airplane, we slowed down. An enemy flying boat could be seen in the direction indicated by the observer. Soon it opened fire with machine guns. I ordered to return fire on the plane with a twin 13mm machine gun. It would be ruin for the boat to sink in front of the enemy. It was better to fight. The airplane flew over the boat and disappeared. I ordered a ceasefire, changed course abruptly, and the boat continued onward. Probably the enemy had radar. It appeared again, and almost immediately a bomb exploded behind the stern of the boat. The danger was increasing, and we again opened machine gun fire. The upper deck of the boat was strewn with shell casings. The electromechanical personnel tried to bring rifles to the bridge to fire on the enemy. I said that firing rifles was useless and directed them to bring up ammunition. Enemy bullets were laying down all around us, but fortunately did no harm. Soon the airplane flew away, probably unable to withstand the battle, but we had to assume that it would return. And so it did. This time the attack was somewhat different. The airplane fired indiscriminately, and after some time withdrew without approaching the boat. We were not able to shoot down the plane, but we organized a good defense, which raised the mood of the team, strengthened of confidence. We were approaching our base, and the general atmosphere in the boat improved. At last dawn came. It was a beautiful dawn, the like of which we had not seen for a long time. The submarine entered the port of Rabaul on the morning of March 22nd. Our arduous actions to deliver supplies was over. The battle for Leh was underway. The submarine I-176 underwent repairs in metropolitan waters. Damage caused by machine gun fire from enemy aircraft was repaired. She returned to Rabaul a second time with a new commander, LT. CMDR. K. Yamaguchi, and again found herself in a difficult situation on the return passage from Leh. The boat was proceeding in a surface position at night when a flare shell suddenly exploded over her. The commander gave the order, immediate dive. The moment the upper deck had just disappeared under water, something heavy struck the bridge. There was no time to clarify what had happened. When we were at a depth of 13.5 meters, something exploded above us, but it was too weak for a bomb. Feeling somewhat uneasy, we continued the dive and only stopped at a depth of 27 meters. As the boat was quite heavy, the emergency dive went on without stopping. We remained in an underwater position for some time, then surfaced in the daytime, believing that we had come within range of our guard force. To our amazement, we found that the forward part of the running bridge fence was badly bent. The magnetic compass nacelles had fallen down on the bridge, and a rather long cylindrical object was lying next to it in the resulting dent. Inspection showed that it was a depth bomb, which was also confirmed by the inscription in English on the bomb casing. The running bridge was covered with some dirty yellow substance. This was none other than the explosive substance from the depth bomb. The bomb, dropped from an enemy airplane, fell into the water just above the bridge of the submerged boat and broke apart. The explosive substance was washed out of the bomb casing by salt water. At the specified depth, the bomb fuse went off, but did not cause an explosion. It was the happiest case for us. We delivered the depth bomb to the base and handed it over to its destination. In January 1944, commanding the submarine Row 44, I was ordered to go to the Solomon Islands to act to disrupt the rear communications of the enemy. Since at that time many of our submarines were often killed in such missions, it was necessary to take precautions, especially in the choice of route. According to our assumption, there were few ways of approach to areas free of enemy submarines and patrol aircraft. If there was a need to pass through areas that were within range of enemy aircraft, submarines had to go through them in an underwater position both during the day and at night. Having completed the necessary preparations, the boat put to sea. After crossing the equator, the conditions in the submarine were very difficult due to the high temperature, despite the presence of an air conditioning unit. As we approached Truk Island, we saw in the night sky the reflection of wide streaks of flame. Frequent explosions were heard, and we soon realized that the situation there was hopeless. For 4 days, patrolling the approaches to Truk, surfacing at night and diving during the day, we waited for an encounter with the enemy. Our month's supply of food was running out. Finally, the order was received to enter Truk Bay. The choice of a suitable course for entering the bay was a great risk. It was necessary to find a passage among our sunken ships. In spite of the difficulties, we still succeeded in entering the bay without much incident. The sight of overturned and sunken ships, their masts sticking out of the water, created a depressing impression. We anchored at the submarine base. The floating submarine base was sunk at its usual anchorage, and all valuable supplies were sunk with it. I went ashore to report to the Chief of Staff, who already had fears that we had been sunk, as there had been no news from us for a long time. The last report from the submarine Row 39 was received when she was off Vorthia Island, but the text of the report could not be deciphered. She has not been heard from since, and the circumstances of her sinking are unknown. After the Americans occupied the Marshall Islands, the pace of their offensive in the Western Pacific was very high. The strike, struck on February 17, 1944, by a large group of American aircraft carriers on the base Truk, was a natural result of the occupation of the Marshall Islands by the enemy. Truk Base was our central base of operations in the Solomon and Marshall Islands areas. Until the Marshall Islands were occupied by the enemy, Truk also served as a base for the United States Navy, which was then forced to relocate to Palau. On the day of the attack on Truk, patrol planes of our aviation conducted reconnaissance in areas of probable appearance of the enemy. Due to bad weather, only about half of the usual number of patrol aircraft were in the air, and even those had returned to base by the time of the attack. The enemy approached Truk when the storm reached its greatest strength. A large number of enemy carrier aircraft suddenly appeared over Truk. The first airstrike was on the Takeshima Air Base. Fighter planes rose from the airbase and made an attempt to intercept the enemy planes. However, some of them did not even have ammunition. Almost all of the aircraft were shot down. In addition, in the bay was sunk 6 warships and 26 transports. Losses of our aviation amounted to 180 aircraft. The approaching enemy line ships set fire to our precious fuel reserves, which after that burned for several days, illuminating the target for the American planes B-17, operating at night. Under the circumstances, Rabaul lost its importance as an air base, so the air units based on it were redeployed. Solomon Islands were surrendered to the enemy. Thus our forces had to leave the outer area of combat operations and had to take measures to defend the inner area. In other words, the line of defense from Saipan, Guam moved to the line of the Philippines, Okinawa. If we lost them too, we would find ourselves facing an attack directly on Japan. The submarines based at Rabaul were withdrawn from it after the air units were relocated. The boats were loaded with food for our beleaguered forces stationed at Mili Atoll. The 4 submarines left Truk in the midst of an enemy air raid. Special containers loaded with food and tobacco were attached to the upper deck of each boat, and compartments inside the rugged hull held ammunition for the 25mm guns. Having passed in an underwater position a dangerous area where enemy submarines were operating, our boats followed a surface course during the daytime. Unfortunately, the special food containers mounted on the deck of our boat began to break off and, despite a reduction in speed, they were all lost before the boat reached its destination. We had no choice but to return to base, make the necessary repairs and start all over again. Having again loaded the necessary supplies, we put to sea a second time. Off the Marshall Islands, in areas controlled by the enemy, went in an underwater position. It was important that we were not detected, otherwise the whole operation could end in failure. There was a fear that our plan was known to the enemy, as he could have seized the code from the garrison of Mili Atoll. We had the new code, but the announcement of our arrival at that atoll was made by the old code. After passing Jalant Atoll safely, we set course for Mili Atoll. It was a bright moonlit night. Noticing something resembling a ship's mast just off the bow on the horizon, we made an emergency dive. Then, watching through the periscope, we saw a battleship followed by 2 aircraft carriers. It seemed to be an opportunity granted to us by the sky. We increased the stroke of the boat and tried to approach at a shorter distance. The battleship was already quite close, the aircraft carriers were somewhat behind it. Then, quite suddenly, the ships changed course, perhaps they had detected the boat. We surfaced and began pursuit, but the superiority in speed of the enemy ships did not allow us to get closer to the distance of the salvo. An hour later we again sighted the ship's mast and, diving to periscope depth, found 6 destroyers in a frontline formation approaching us at quite a considerable speed. Perhaps these were the aircraft carrier and line ship guard ships we had encountered earlier. Or perhaps it was a separate formation of anti-submarine ships. To avoid being detected, we were forced to change course. Periscope observation confirmed that the enemy ships were coming in a frontline formation and could be easily attacked. To attack or not to attack. Torpedoes were prepared to fire, but our orders stated that our main tasks were to deliver supplies and reconnaissance. However, we were given the right to deviate from this order if the targets were a battleship or aircraft carrier. Attacking other targets was forbidden. Thus, we were forced to abandon the attack. When the enemy ships hid, we surfaced. During the time the boat was underwater, the batteries were significantly discharged, and so on the way to Mili Atoll we hastily recharged the batteries. As the day progressed, we dived again. The boat arrived at Mili Atoll in the evening of the next day, and we began to survey the place where the supplies were to be unloaded. The moon was shining and visibility was good. The enemy did not show themselves. It was decided that the boat should remain submerged during the unloading of the provisions, although it seemed to us that these precautions were hardly necessary. After requesting the shore by semaphore whether the passage into the channel ahead of us was clear, and receiving an affirmative answer, we entered the interior of the atoll. Enemy spy planes often appeared during the night, so the boat remained submerged while the unloading of food was in progress. We then surfaced and made contact with the deputy commander of the unit on shore, from whom we received gifts in gratitude for all our misadventures. The unit had been waiting for mail and food for a long time. The men lived in the jungle and were subjected to daily enemy air raids. The soldiers who came up to the submarine for supplies seemed more interested in smoking than eating. We gave them a case of cigarettes, and in addition gave away our entire own supply of cigarettes. To me, a non-smoker, their passion for tobacco seemed somewhat strange. Nevertheless, we felt very sorry for them, because the situation they were in was unenviable. There was no news of the situation on Majuro Atoll, 50 miles from Mili Atoll. We were to proceed there to ascertain the situation on the spot, and therefore requested the garrison commander of Mili Atoll to report our departure using a new code. At about 19 HRs, we left the atoll. The previous day, enemy aircraft had dropped several mines, most of which fell on the shore. Nevertheless, leaving the atoll was a great test of nerves. Still, we got out safely and set course for Majuro Atoll. On March 12th at 23 hours, seeing red lights ahead of us, we made an emergency dive. While observing through periscope, we noticed that the number of lights was increasing. Suddenly a whole row of lights, like a torchlight procession, came into view. It looked very much like an airfield. The personnel got a rest, waiting for dawn. At 3:30 a.m., it was now quite light, and what we took to be an airfield turned out to be a group of ships that were anchored inside the atoll. There was one aircraft carrier, 8 line ships and several tank landing ships. The distance to the nearest line ship was about 500 meters. A command followed to prepare to take a photo through the periscope. We then realized that our task of delivering supplies would not be accomplished if the boat came within a short distance of the ships. We saw twin-engine airplanes taking off and landing on the aircraft carrier. After observing the enemy for some time, we withdrew to a safe distance and charged the batteries, and when darkness fell, in a surface position we went to reconnoiter the entrance to Majuro Atoll. Visibility was poor due to fog, but the sea was relatively calm. Suddenly we spotted an enemy aircraft carrier. To avoid meeting it, we dived. The aircraft carrier was apparently returning from an operation and did not notice our boat. When we surfaced again, we found the silhouette of a ship on the horizon that looked like a destroyer. Changing course to 16 rhombus, we withdrew, and at dawn we were convinced of the correctness of our assumption. It was indeed a destroyer. I must say that all cases of enemy detection were due to the presence of special binoculars. Soon we laid down on the former course, but the shore did not open for a long time. Then the boat approached a small island, on which, as it seemed to us, there was an airfield. However, the absence of enemy planes indicated that we were wrong. Having rounded the island, the boat continued to head in a westerly direction. Suddenly we heard the noise of the propellers of a patrol ship. Then it turned out that there were even 2 of them. We evaded meeting them, and at 18H, March 13th, after 20 hours underwater, surfaced. I sent a report to the commander of the United Fleet behind the reef atoll Majuro. Our anchored 1 aircraft carrier, 8 line and several other large enemy ships. Medium bombers are based at the atoll airfield. After charging the batteries, I informed the command more thoroughly regarding the composition of the enemy forces. Our task was safely accomplished, and at the end of March the boat returned to Truk. On the return trip we discovered a transport, but after inquiries from headquarters it was found that the transport was our own. On arrival at Truk, I went ashore and went for a formal report to headquarters, where I was asked why I had not attacked the destroyer squadron. I reported that I had acted in accordance with the order given me, and that the mission would not have been considered accomplished until the report of the concentration of ships at Majuro had been transmitted. It is true that I always regretted that I could not make the attack. Incidentally, I was surprised by the fact that all 4 boats that went with us returned safely to Truk. Although not all of them accomplished their missions, it had nevertheless been a long time since we had seen such an occasion when all the ships that went out on an operation returned to base. About 4 months later, toward the end of the fighting for Saipan, the commanders of these submarines were dead, and only I-32 survived. The submarine I-32 made a second trip with food and ammunition to Mili Atoll, but the supplies did not reach their destination and the boat itself was never heard from again. After the war, we learned that the boat I-32 was sunk by the American fleet off Mili Atoll on March 24th. On March 31st, 2 planes carrying Admiral Koga, commander of the United Fleet, and his staff left Palau. But the planes did not reach their destination, and nothing more was heard of them. All operations effectively came to a halt. Air raids on Truk intensified, and each time the submarines there had to lie down on the ground to avoid sinking. The submarine I-169 lying on the ground had one compartment flooded. After the air raid was over, she was unable to surface. Attempts to raise the boat failed, after which the tugs were removed and all hope of rescue was lost. Rescue operations in the conditions of constant air raids were impossible. Later, the enemy struck at the place where the submarines were lying on the ground. The depth there was shallow, about 23 meters. The enemy dropped several bombs directly over the boat Row 44, which I commanded. At the time of the explosions of the bombs, felt strong shaking of the hull of the boat, but there was no entry of water inside the boat. Upon surfacing, it was discovered that the boat's periscopes were badly damaged. Since it was impossible to repair them in Truk, we left the bay one night, heading for Japan. Having safely passed the areas where enemy submarines could operate, and leaving Saipan far to the east, we went full speed already in a surface position both day and night. One day during the campaign, while I was on the bridge, an observer reported his airplane approaching. The plane was approaching from the traverse, and I was inclined to take it for my own, but it soon became clear to me that it was coming in to attack our boat, and that it was an enemy plane. I immediately gave the order to make an emergency dive. By this time the plane was almost over us, and if it had started dropping bombs, the boat should have been better off staying in a surface position, so I cancelled my first order. In the last seconds, as we waited for the bombs to explode, the pilot was evidently still in doubt as to whether it was his own boat or the enemy's. Then the bombs fell. The first 2 bombs landed only 5 to 10 meters from the stern, but there was no damage. We started to dive urgently, but barely the water reached the base of the deckhouse, the enemy fired machine guns at us. A moment more, and we were under the protection of the sea. When the boat surfaced an hour later, bullet holes were found on the deck. The next day we expected another raid, and so kept a close watch on the air from the sun. At sunset, the enemy reappeared. We plunged in and waited for about an hour, but nothing much happened. On April 29th, we arrived at Kure, where I turned the boat over to the new commander. It was his first time commanding a submarine, and so temporarily I went to sea with him for exercises. The boat named Row 44 was sunk by an American destroyer off Eniwetok Atoll on June 5, 1944.